HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents 2 A.M. in Little America by Ken Kalfus. Read by B.J. Harrison. 1. Like many people my age, I found myself in a foreign city where I took a low-paying job in a semi-menial field that I hadn't previously contemplated. This work wasn't unpleasant. It brought me several times a day up to the city's rooftops, above the traffic noises, where I was surrounded by the pinnacles of the city's most ambitious skyscrapers, and I caught views of its churning bay and the forested mountains in the distance. I would usually need about a half hour to check the security equipment that I was assigned to certify as operational. I would repair it, if necessary. Then, in good weather, I would take a few minutes to savor the prospect and the occasional sea breezes, so that I could recall them later as I went to bed. I worked alone, with my own thoughts. I hoped to keep the job indefinitely, or at least until my visa situation became untenable. The equipment was often put in awkward locations on the roofs, sometimes in crawl spaces or on walls that could be reached only by my portable step stool. On the warm afternoon when I first saw the woman, who had come to occupy a sizable but uncertain place in my imagination, I had been sent to a medium-rise building on the city's less affluent north side. The apartment house was several decades old, and, like many other buildings, it had been augmented by extra stories and ad hoc structures to accommodate the recent influx of city residents, mostly foreign migrants and people from the country's rural areas. After taking the elevator to the 6th floor, I climbed another flight to reach the door to the upper roof. The unit's control panel was mounted waist-high to a brick wall, squeezed between two rooftop additions. I recalled that I had inspected the same unit once before. It had worked normally then. Squatting on the balls of my feet, mostly in shadow, I now opened the panel. Several tests confirmed that the circuit board needed replacement. I disconnected the power and jimmied out the board. There was a new one in my toolbox. I worked on the installation with my usual absorption, even though I was aware that someone had turned on a light in one of the new flats behind me and was moving around. Water was running. I retested the unit and put back my tools. I rose, turned to go, and took a step past the screened open window between the flat's cinder-block lower wall and its aluminum-sided upper section. The window was apparently located in the flat's bathroom, where a woman was taking a shower, her back to the shower head, the front of her body facing the window. I recoiled as if I had seen something horrible, which I hadn't. I pushed myself back against the wall where the control panel was located. I didn't want to surprise her or do anything furtive that could provoke a call to the police. I waited a minute, thinking about my next step. The water stopped. I had barely seen her, no more than a flash of alarmingly naked wet skin. I had worked for some time in this job, roaming across the city's roofs. Nothing like this had ever happened before. I hoped the woman would draw her shade, but the long, low window may have provided the flat's only ventilation. Many of this teeming neighborhood's first rooftop additions had been broken into even smaller flats, leaving some with strangely sized rooms, improvisational kitchens and bathrooms, and inconveniently placed windows. Warm, moist air streamed from the window screen, rippling the deep blue late-afternoon sky above my head. I smelled soap, possibly scented with something citrus. My presence on the roof was easily explained, of course, and my story would be confirmed by my employer. If the police were called, however, they would be obliged to inspect my visa and my work papers. The documents were mostly in order, but not entirely. One stamp was missing, and another had expired, and perhaps there were other problems of which I wasn't aware. The residency rules were always changing, Yet I couldn't hide against the wall indefinitely. That on its own would raise suspicions, if I were seen from one of the neighboring buildings. The only thing to do was to announce myself. I ran a hand through my hair and straightened the creases in my uniform shirt. Squaring my shoulders, I stepped directly in front of the window screen. Half averting my eyes, I put on a face that expressed abject regret and embarrassment, and I lifted the toolbox to show the woman why I was there. I was about to mumble a few words of apology that would have been fully sincere. She stood before me and held a flower-patterned towel away from her side. She was air-drying for now, while she tried to pull a troublesome tangle from her just-washed hair. She hadn't flinched when I suddenly appeared, even though she was looking in my direction. Her eyes were open wide. Her lips were pursed in thought. She evidently didn't see me. A spell cast by the room's internal lighting, the dimness in the space between the rooftop structures, and the dense screen, meant to keep out the city's endemic gnat swarms, had rendered me invisible. She herself was perfectly seen, from the crown of wet hair to her feet. The image washed over me like a wave. I realized then that the woman was an image in fact. She wasn't at the window, as I first thought, but standing in front of a slightly fogged, full-length mirror attached to the inside of the open bathroom door, opposite the window. Yet I remained in her line of sight. I raised my toolbox again and mouthed another apology at the reflection. She still didn't see me. Now that I was in the clear, I should have left the roof and continued on my way. But after another moment at the window, I fell back against the wall that held the repaired control panel, the woman's nakedness still filling my eyes. The threat of being caught was real. Any legal offense risked my deportation. The chance I took by remaining on the roof ran counter to every instinct for self-preservation that had governed my life since I went abroad. There had been several close calls, but not from any recklessness on my part. I had also avoided doing wrong, or at least I had avoided doing anything wrong that was not necessary for my survival. I was aware now that, in having watched her through the window screen, I had gratuitously trespassed on the woman's right to privacy, a principle that may have fallen into desuetude in the current century, yet a value or quality that I scrounged for in my own exacting days and disturbed nights. And the ridiculous words "peeping Tom" still carried opprobrium, signifying a pathetic transgression that reminded the Tom of his sexual want. And this reminded me of my sexual want. I had not been with a woman in years. In these years, in my 20s, I had suffered many privations, not being with a woman laughably the least of them, but I was keenly conscious that it had been a long time, on another continent, since I observed a woman's smile of tender affection, or been the target of a flirtatious sally, or been anyone's romantic possibility, or been offered the most fleeting view of a woman's bare, rude, robust animal body. I was ashamed by my impulse. At the same time, I knew that if I returned to the window screen, and if the woman didn't see me, I wouldn't be taking anything from her, or doing anything that would bring her harm or in any way intrude upon her existence. To turn away now, and to not be present for her ordinary female beauty, would have been an offense against myself, I thought, a denial of my humanness, a denial of life. I stepped before the window and again made a sign of apology. It was not met with a response. The woman, who was about my age, still fussed with her hair. The mirror's reflection gave her the appearance of being no more than 4 feet away. The day was humid, and drops from the shower still glistened on her limbs. As she leaned over to reach her lower legs, they tensed. She continued to gaze at herself in the mirror, right at me. I took this in, hungrily, just as I had taken in my views of the city's skyline, its bay, and the countryside, with the intention and conviction that I would never forget them. Her face was pretty, though perhaps not conventionally so. Or perhaps it was conventionally pretty, but transformed by the liberties taken by my covert observation. I looked into the depths of her eyes. They suggested, to me in this moment, receptiveness and sympathy. I gifted myself the thought of what it might be like to be kissed by this woman. As I stared, I wondered if I had seen the woman before. Of course, I had seen her before, only 2 minutes earlier, when I passed in front of the window screen as she came out of the shower, and then again a few moments later when I looked back, and again in the past 30 or 40 seconds when I was directing at her the entirety of my attention. I was aware that this was likely an illusion of familiarity, with which I had some previous experience, discovering that it could arise in any close quarters, say in a cafe or on a train. You notice somebody, they make a strong impression, and then when you see them again shortly later, the first instance feels like a long-standing memory. Disembarking from a long international flight, I often felt that I had known some of the passengers my whole life, though I was acquainted with them only from having observed them walking to and from the toilets or reaching for their blankets in the overhead bins. The sense that I might recognize this woman was the same kind of self-deception, I told myself. But I found the thought unpersuasive. I continued to wonder if she was someone I had once seen in the street, or on the corniche, or on a bus. Or was she someone I had known in the past, from my first travels, or from even before then? Could she possibly be an American? Some vague recollection stirred, but I didn't trust it. I knew how intensely I thought of America, how regularly I imagined myself there, walking the shady, cracked, root-heaved sidewalks of the small community in which I had grown up, or entering the diner, or taking my position on the county ball field. At night, whatever dreams made sense usually took place in America. When I woke, I was often surprised to find myself abroad. It might take me several moments to remember where, or especially why, a complicated series of causes and effects. In my daily life on the streets of this foreign city, I couldn't stop looking for things and people that were at least remotely connected to America, evidence that the place still existed. I wondered now if this intense longing for home had somehow conjured my sense of half-familiarity with the woman, the object of a parallel, not too dissimilar kind of longing. The woman's hair had been untangled, and she made some private smile at a private thought, though of course the smile was not as private as she believed. I wished I could know the thought that inspired it. Then she turned and reached somewhere beyond the edge of the mirror's image. The bare expanse of her back was presented like a pristine, unpopulated territory. When she faced the mirror again, she held a pair of black plastic-rimmed eyeglasses in her hands, and I realized that a component of my invisibility might have been her nearsightedness. She raised the glasses to her face. Without even a lingering last look, careful not to kick the gravel on the surface of the roof, I moved quickly from the window. 2 more assignments were left to my day. I didn't tell anyone about this odd, happy adventure. I suppose if I had some close male friends, as I once had in another life, I might have related the story excitedly. "You wouldn't believe what just happened to me." I would have elaborated upon my rooftop predicament. My buddies would have been amused, perhaps raising a toast to her beauty. They might have even shared similarly providential experiences. Now, among my few acquaintances, some from countries with unpredictable, stringent mores regarding the male gaze and the female body, the story would have been embarrassing, and a confession of wrongdoing, even untrustworthiness. I wouldn't have told any of the men with whom I shared a flat, which was located in a cinder-block mid-rise near the Beltway, on a desiccated plain of cinder-block mid-rises. We kept a wary distance from each other, and from each other's personal illegalities. There were 9 of us, 3 to a cell-like room, all of us migrants, all still learning the local language, all with probable visa infractions. None were Americans, and I knew very few compatriots abroad. Americans kept away from each other then. We were humiliated by what had happened. We would have reminded each other only of our grief and our shame. Also, when 2 Americans met, you couldn't know which side the other had joined, nor what actions that person had taken, nor what he or she had suffered. In going abroad, we had shed the many indicators of partisanship, haircuts, clothing choices, to fit in more easily among the local people, if that was possible, or at least to gain some anonymity among the population of migrants from other countries. We tried to remain invisible to each other. I certainly didn't advertise my nationality among non-Americans. People around the world shared contempt for how far our country had fallen. Some of that contempt was expressed with pleasure. They recalled our former national pride, which they had considered, even at the time, vain and overweening. They remembered, too, how we had dominated international politics and global popular culture, and the many errors, or crimes, we had committed at home and abroad, now under investigation by an international commission. They remembered the sanctimony. They remembered the lectures. They remembered the displays of entitlement. The wars, too. They were glad for our comeuppance, even when it had presented difficulties for their own countries. Some of these countries had inevitably replayed American political arguments and social disputes, adapted to their histories. They were bitter about that as well. My paperwork showed that I was a United States citizen, but in casual conversation, I might say that I was Canadian, and I occasionally found myself pretending familiarity with the city of Toronto. Not speaking of the woman didn't mean I forgot her, of course. I remembered everything I had seen. She was added to a small, vital archive. When I was alone, or trying to be alone, I deliberately flipped through the files. Unable to sleep, buffeted by the snores and other night sounds of my flatmates, or crammed into a bus to or from the city's untidy outskirts, I would summon certain images to my mind. I could, for example, almost recreate my hometown and see myself driving my parents' car to the stores, passing every mailbox and gas station, block by block. Or I thought of this city's skyline and the vistas of the bay that I had more recently observed, capturing pleasing details that I might have missed at first. Or, as I did many times in the next few days, almost in a trance, I illuminated on the screen of my consciousness a picture of the woman's hale, unclothed self. Every curve, every hair, the hollows of her ankles, her contemplative expression. These memories, significant to me alone, belonging to me alone, represented a kind of sanctuary. Although my thoughts dwelled on the woman, I never seriously considered returning to the roof of the building to spy on her. It would have been dangerous to be seen lurking there, and I knew anyway that I couldn't replicate the conditions of sun and shadow that had made me unseeable. Also, it would have been simply too pervy. What I had already done had at least bumped up against the edge of wrongness, but I felt free to think of her nakedness without restraint, and I hoped I would see her again somewhere. I thought we might somehow meet. I thought we might find a way to exchange a few words. I intently looked into the faces of the women around me on the city's packed sidewalks and public transportation. I was hardly surprised then, a couple of weeks later, when I encountered her crossing the square in front of the city's main cathedral, for it felt as if my relentless visualizing had beamed the woman directly into this place. I saw her from 40 or 50 meters, coming at me, navigating the cobblestones in modestly heeled shoes. She wore what I supposed was an office outfit, a snug, mid-length gray skirt, a white button-down blouse, and a short red jacket, open in the seasonable weather. Her now dry hair was shaped in what was then a fashionable style. It was near lunchtime, and she was carrying an unopened yogurt container and a plastic spoon. We were only a few blocks from her flat. As she approached, I looked her in the face long enough to appreciate her features and to make an effort to remember how they presented themselves at the moment. I took note of her mouth, now sharply lipsticked, her eyes, and the shape of her eyebrows. She wasn't wearing the glasses. Perhaps she wore contact lenses whenever she left the flat. The woman didn't detect my interest any more than she had when I was on the roof. I avoided eye contact, and then turned away so that my scrutiny wouldn't be obvious. She was really quite lovely, I thought. We went by each other, and I continued on for several meters. Then, slowly, so as not to attract attention from the other passers-by, I turned to watch her go. She dodged a puddle left from the recent rains. Other pedestrians swirled around me. After a few moments, there was a small let-up in her gait, and she also seemed about to stop and turn, as if she sensed my eyes on her. I didn't really think this awareness was possible, though people often spoke of it, and I may have read that the phenomenon had been observed in animals. Regardless of my skepticism, I went on my way, my ears burning from the embarrassment of nearly being caught. At what? Looking at a pretty woman on the square? I suppose I blushed instead from fear that I would still be found out for my first misconduct. But by the time I boarded the tram that took me to my next service call, I began to doubt that the woman was the same person I had seen in the flat. The determined frame of this woman's face was different from the more open, more vulnerable expression on the others, and the features may not have been precisely identical, one with more widely spaced eyes, the other with a sharper nose. I couldn't be sure that this woman's hair was cut similarly to the hair I had seen wet from the shower. And now the face of the woman in the square was fresher in my mind, blurring the image of the original. I inwardly smiled at my confusion. This was a petty vexation compared to the other difficulties in my life. There was some question about how much longer I could keep my bed in the flat. A hole had declared itself on the bottom of my irreplaceable right shoe, but I knew, too, that the brief moment on the roof was still something I would hold dear. After this non-meeting on the plaza, I saw the woman again, once in the window of a cafe in her neighborhood, sipping an espresso, and then in another part of town, where she was leaving an office building with some colleagues or friends. And again I couldn't make a positive identification with the woman in the flat. I couldn't even be sure that these additional sightings were of the same person, especially after I saw her again in another neighborhood, wearing a worker's denim overalls, and again elsewhere in yet other neighborhoods, with longer hair and wire-rimmed eyeglasses, and stouter, shorter, or more pale than I remembered her, or apparently affiliated with another ethnicity, or pushing a baby carriage. I realized now that all the women of the city were gradually coming to resemble in my mind the woman who had been in the flat that afternoon. And this was a good thing, for now I made my rounds, crowded into one conveyance or another, in a slightly elevated state of desire, something I had hardly felt since I left the States. I enjoyed traveling among these women. They were imbued with life, optimism, and high-spirited sexuality, it seemed. I listened attentively to their song-like conversations. I deeply inhaled their sweet, complicated scents, every one her own. Through these women, even though I thought they were beyond the possible acquaintance of a penniless migrant, I developed a stronger connection to the city, and I began to think of it as something like home. It's not unusual for migrants to voice this sentiment prematurely. A few months later, but not so much later that I had forgotten the woman, the country in which I was living experienced a period of political turmoil. New immigration laws were passed in response. These were strict laws, it seemed, but they still had to work their way through the courts. Some of the provisions were complicated, and I was unsure how they would affect my status. Anti-immigration activists, inside and outside the legislature, didn't think the laws went far enough. This view was expressed with small-scale violence, broken shop windows, and assaults of people who looked like they could be migrants. The pro-immigration forces, such as they were, suggested that the governing party was provoking its militant opponents in order to make itself seem more moderate. Further appeasing the angry nativists, the government withdrew its support of the International Investigative Commission before it could interview witnesses. Around this time, the flat was taken over by a gang that had moved into the area. I arrived one evening and found my few things picked through and dumped in the hallway. I couldn't protest. I spent that night and the next at the company where I worked, sleeping in the unheated equipment shed through the indulgence of a semi-friendly, semi-negligent watchman. I then obtained, through a series of faint connections, a place in another tenement, or rather a still warm, still fragrant nighttime bed, occupied during the day by a migrant with a nocturnal work schedule. I had to be out by 5 a.m. I continued to conduct my inspections and repairs. A few days after I began sleeping in the new place, I was given an assignment to check the equipment located on the roof of a large department store. I headed on foot along the city's main commercial boulevard, carrying my toolbox. Gloomily absorbed with the problems that were presented by my new living arrangements, I may have put aside my customary alertness and didn't recognize that trouble was collecting itself up ahead. Other pedestrians were more aware. They turned and streamed back down the sidewalk, not on a panicked run, but determined to get away. I went another half block before I stopped. The disturbance was either a march or a demonstration, which were generally legal, but it appeared to be unauthorized, and the government hadn't given the protesters a place to rally. Mostly men, most of them young, they moved down the sidewalk in our direction. They waved football flags and chanted anti-immigrant slogans. Some of the flags were attached to sticks. The police, lined along the curb in the street, had evidently been ordered to keep the roadway unblocked. The boulevard was a vital traffic corridor whose easy flow was valued by the city government as a measure of its competence. Also, the national government was showing its resolve against the opposition. The shops had locked up and lowered their grills. Pedestrians could only go back, where, when I turned, I saw a squad of helmeted riot police massing in the plaza in front of the government offices. But the government hadn't anticipated a march of this size. The police arrayed along the side of the road were aware of this miscalculation. They didn't have visors or other equipment with which to face a hostile crowd. A sergeant frantically consulted with a superior over a walkie-talkie, trying to explain how the sidewalk was becoming congested. If the march was going to be kept on the sidewalk, they needed to allow the pedestrians into the street. We heard the order in return, squawked from the radio, "Keep traffic moving." The other cops looked harassed and worried. They were young, possibly new recruits. There were nowhere near enough of them. I expected to be punched or spat upon. This had happened before, but hoped that I would then be allowed to go on my way. The people around me didn't share my feeble optimism. As the knot tightened, some became anxious about the potential for serious violence, and others increasingly indignant. Several women, probably native-born, abused the cops for their haplessness. A few pedestrians tried to step off the curb, but the police gripped both ends of their nightsticks and pushed them back onto the sidewalk, forcefully, but not without sympathy. They called for reinforcements in vain. Cars and trucks continued to pass at nearly normal speeds. I allowed myself to be buffeted by the surging crowd. I looked down at my feet as the marchers approached, trying to make myself even more anonymous than usual. I fiercely held on to the toolbox. My first priority was not to lose it in a scuffle or a chase. The sergeant finally...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?